Francis Ngannou's journey is nothing short of incredible. With little more than the clothes he was wearing on his back, he left Cameroon in search of a better life. Ngannou faced numerous trials and tribulations as he made his way to mainland Europe and spent time sleeping on the streets of France. He then became the UFC's heavyweight champion and is now one of the biggest stars in boxing. Let's take a deeper dive into Francis Ngannou's remarkable journey. When we think of Francis Ngannou today, it's hard to imagine the former UFC heavyweight champion ever being bullied at school. But he was. Childhood wasn't a particularly happy time for Ngannou as he struggled to make friends. His family were poor, and he was ridiculed by other pupils at school for not having a pen to make notes in class. At just 10 years old, Ngannou got a job in the local sand quarry to raise much-needed funds for his family. He worked in the quarry for 7 years until he left school at 17. Inspired by Mike Tyson, a 22-year-old Ngannou decided to channel his pent-up anger and frustration into boxing, against his family's wishes. After training for 12 months, he had to put his boxing dreams on hold due to an illness, and over the next 3 years, he took various jobs in his village to make ends meet. Disillusioned with how his life was panning out, Ngannou decided to leave Cameroon in search of a better life, and embarked on a journey to emigrate to Paris. After traveling over 3,000 kilometers, he arrived in Morocco, a country in northwest Africa that is a popular route into Spain and mainland Europe. Ngannou spent 1 year in Morocco, waiting for the right opportunity to make his voyage over the border into mainland Europe. He spent much of this time sleeping in the forest, trying to evade the border police. Struggling for food, clothes, and sanitation, there were periods when Ngannou almost gave in, due to being so drained, weak, and fed up with his predicament. He persevered, mustering the strength to continue living in these squalid conditions, and after a very long 12 months, made it to Europe. Upon reaching Spain, Ngannou was arrested by Spanish police for illegally crossing the border and was imprisoned for 2 months. Once released, he continued another 2,000 kilometers to Paris, a more achievable journey now that he was on the same continent. After arriving in France, it took a while for his luck to change. Not only was Ngannou over 5,000 kilometers from his home, he had no ID, money, or clothes, other than what he was wearing at the time. Without friends in the French capital, Ngannou had no option but to sleep on the streets in a climate much colder than he was used to. After spending 2 months sleeping in a car park in Paris, he began volunteering for a homeless charity, La Corba, which aimed to provide 900 meals per day to destitute people in the area. The charity's director, Kater Yenbu, learned of Ngannou's desire to become a boxer and introduced him to Didier Carmont. The pair became friends, and Carmont then guided Ngannou towards the MMA factory in Paris, where he began training under the tutelage of Fernand Lopez. Lopez saw potential, and even though Ngannou only had dreams of becoming a boxer, Lopez convinced him to focus his efforts on MMA instead, a sport that Ngannou didn't even know existed before setting foot in the gym. The practice was going well for Ngannou, and he began sleeping inside the MMA factory until suitable accommodation was sourced. 3 years after his foray into mixed martial arts, Francis Ngannou had amassed a 5-1 record and caught the eye of the sport's biggest organization, the UFC. A contract offer soon followed, and Ngannou's debut came in the heavyweight against the Brazilian Luis Henrique on December 19, 2015. In boxing, it's well known that up-and-coming talent gets pitted against journeymen to pad their records. This doesn't happen in the UFC. Fighters with potential are rarely allowed to cherry-pick fights, and Ngannou was no different. His opponent, Henrique, was riding a 6-fight winning streak going into the bout at the Amway Center in Orlando, Florida. The fight didn't start well for Ngannou. 30 seconds in, Henrique caught a leg kick and took him to the ground, unleashing numerous strikes on the UFC debutant. Round 2 was a different story as Ngannou's striking skills became apparent. He landed a flurry of combinations before a vicious left uppercut floored his opponent, and a follow-up hammer fist ended the contest. In his second UFC fight against Curtis Blades, Ngannou gained the upper hand in round 1 and caused swelling to his opponent's right eye. The eye got considerably worse, and the doctor stopped the fight. 3 more stoppage victories followed for Ngannou, including a TKO win against UFC legend Andrei Arlovski. The victory extended his MMA record to 10-1, and was his 5th straight win in the UFC. Just over 4 years since his MMA debut, Francis Ngannou now had a reputation for being one of the best strikers in the UFC. Ngannou had earned himself a #1 contender fight for the UFC heavyweight title against the vastly experienced Alistair Overeem. The fight was arguably the biggest test for Ngannou in his MMA career so far. Ngannou weathered the storm and delivered a devastating left uppercut to finish his opponent less than 2 minutes into the first round. The finishing sequence has since been labeled as one of the most brutal knockouts in UFC history. It was a huge statement from Ngannou, and fans were drooling at the prospect of a heavyweight title fight between him and Stipe Miocic. UFC 220 took place in Boston, Massachusetts, on January 20, 2018, in front of over 16,000 people at the TD Garden. A far cry from 5 years earlier when Ngannou was homeless and sleeping in a Paris car park. Having recently signed an 8-fight deal with the UFC, Ngannou had his eyes on the main prize of becoming the best in the world. Such aspirations came a little too soon for Ngannou as Stipe Miocic won via unanimous decision in a dominant display. Despite Ngannou's explosive start to life in the UFC, it was clear that he had a lot of learning to do, and he went back to the drawing board. 6 months after his defeat to Miocic, Ngannou looked to get back to winning ways against an informed Derek Lewis, who had won 7 of his last 8 fights. The contest was a huge disappointment as both men failed to engage for much of the fight, with Lewis winning unanimously. Ngannou had now lost 2 fights in a row, and his reputation took a blow following the lackluster showing at UFC 226. Ngannou needed to bounce back in style, and he did. The gun-shy approach we had seen in the previous 2 bouts seemed to be a distant memory as Ngannou won his next 4 fights by stoppage against high-level opponents. The 4 bouts had a combined total fight time of just 2 minutes and 42 seconds. The path of destruction Ngannou went on between November 2018 and May 2020 earned him another crack at Stipe Miocic, who was still the UFC Heavyweight Champion. The rematch took place at UFC 260 on March 27, 2021, in Las Vegas. The second fight was very different from the first, with Ngannou showing a willingness to wrestle and he displayed patience on his feet. After a left high kick landed on the chin of the champion, Ngannou attempted a couple of takedowns and threw a flurry of punches at Miocic's head as he had his back to Ngannou. In the second round, a left hand dropped Miocic, but he was saved from hitting the canvas by the fence of the octagon. An uppercut and left hook from Ngannou then knocked out the greatest heavyweight of all time, and at the second time of asking, Ngannou became the UFC Heavyweight Champion. Ngannou's first title defense came 10 months later against his former teammate at the MMA Factory, Cyril Gane, who had recently become the interim heavyweight champion following a victory over Derek Lewis at UFC 265. The Frenchman's game plan was evident from the first round as he tried to clinch with Ngannou whenever he got within striking range. Sporting a knee injury, Ngannou struggled to get the better of the stand-up exchanges but surprisingly managed to take Gane down repeatedly. Ngannou won via unanimous decision and retained his title. Having now completed his 8-fight contract, Ngannou and the UFC struggled to negotiate a new deal, leaving the heavyweight division in limbo. The relationship between the fighter and promotion became more and more strained, with Ngannou describing the UFC structure akin more to owning a fighter, as opposed to a fighter being an independent contractor. A further annoyance to Ngannou was the fact he lost a sponsorship deal with a cryptocurrency company due to the UFC's affiliation with Crypto.com. Ngannou eventually made the decision not to re-sign with the UFC and indicated in various interviews that he would like to follow his dream and become a boxer. His decision caused shockwaves throughout the MMA world, as he left the organization while being a champion. Some applauded him for his choice, while others within the industry felt that he was making the wrong call. Prominent figures within combat sports felt that it was far-fetched for Ngannou to assume that Tyson Fury would be willing to fight him. After holding talks with One Championship, Bare Knuckle FC, and various boxing promoters, Ngannou announced in May 2023 that he had signed a deal with PFL and would work with the organization to plan and hold an event in Africa in 2024. The deal would also allow Ngannou to cross over into the boxing world in future, should he wish. His manifestations came true as a couple of months later it was announced that he would box Tyson Fury, the unbeaten WBC Heavyweight Champion, in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. On October 28, the shock announcement of Ngannou's fight with Tyson Fury drew criticism from both the MMA and boxing worlds. Most gave the Predator no more than a puncher's chance against the lineal heavyweight champion, Tyson Fury, and the bout was largely derided by the media as being a mismatch. After a somewhat mooted build-up, partly due to the media not showing too much interest in the fight, Fury vs. Ngannou ended up being one for the history books. The fight began with Fury throwing a Hail Mary, which narrowly missed Ngannou before the WBC champion landed a couple of stiff jabs. Despite having never boxed professionally before, Ngannou looked calm in the ring and adopted a stance that indicated he knew what he was doing. Then, in the third, Ngannou knocked down Fury with a left hook, which left everybody in shock. After Fury got up, Ngannou remained patient and didn't apply too much pressure but still won the round 10-8 due to the knockdown. After the first 5 rounds, Ngannou was up on most people's scorecards and had taken everybody by surprise, probably even himself. Typically, in his previous fights, Fury had been the bigger and stronger man, using this to his advantage in the clinch. Ngannou's years of MMA training, coupled with his sheer size, meant he could handle this. As the final round began, it seemed as though Fury would need a knockout to avoid being on the receiving end of one of the biggest upsets in combat sports history. Surprisingly, Fury stayed patient in the final 3 minutes, and as the final bell rang, there was a feeling that the real-life Rocky Balboa story just happened. But it's boxing, after all, and as we've seen many times before, there is no such thing as a foregone conclusion when predicting judges' scorecards. They read 95-94 Ngannou, 96-93 Fury, 95-94 Fury. Although Ngannou lost the decision, many thought he had won the fight. A moral victory for Ngannou? Undoubtedly. A robbery? Debatable. Regardless of the result, the stock of Francis Ngannou was now at an all-time high thanks to his heroic feat. He came a cat's whisker away from defeating arguably the best heavyweight boxer of this generation. Not content on pressing pause on his boxing endeavor, Ngannou looked for another high-profile fight. Rumors began to circulate about a rematch with Tyson Fury, while Deontay Wilder, Anthony Joshua, and Joseph Parker's names were rumored to be in the mix. Then, less than 3 months after Ngannou's fight with Fury, it was announced that his next opponent will be Anthony Joshua. The mega fight is scheduled for Friday, March 8 in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, as high-profile boxing continues to take over the Middle East. The fight has captured everyone's imagination. Unlike the Tyson Fury fight, this one certainly isn't a gimmick, as the world now knows that Francis Ngannou can mix it with the highest caliber. Joshua vs. Ngannou is a battle of two-man mountains with ferocious punching power. The general consensus is that the fight won't go the distance. Come March 9th, Francis Ngannou will have only ever had 2 professional boxing matches, and they've come against Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua, respectively. Where Ngannou goes after the Joshua fight remains to be seen. He has a contract with PFL, who recently acquired Bellator. More heavyweight options are now available to him in MMA, and it's unsure whether or not he is contractually obliged to fight in the PFL or not soon. Now ranked in the top 10 of the WBC rankings, Ngannou will have plenty of boxing offers too. One thing is for sure. Francis Ngannou doesn't do things by half measure. By his mid-20s, he had seen and experienced more than most people do in their lifetime. Just a snippet of the adversity he faced would be enough to break many of us, but Ngannou used said challenges as rocket fuel, overcoming obstacle upon obstacle to forge a better life for himself and his family. He went from working down in the sand quarries to standing on top of the world. Many said Francis Ngannou fumbled the bag when he left the UFC. It's more like he took all the bags.